Hey everybody, it's Silver. This is Lies of P. Yes, that Pinocchio game, that one, it's here. So this is a Soulslike, to put it simply, and I gotta just go ahead and say right from the start, this is a really, really good example of the genre. It does pretty much everything it needs to do, everything that you would expect from the genre quite well, and it also manages to still keep an identity of its own and not feel like it's just sort of going through the paces of what the big boys did without understanding why. It has a lot of competency in its design, I feel, and it's just a really good game in general. But if you're wondering, which does it take inspiration from? Is this more of like a DS1 situation? Is it going for the more open Dark Souls 3 formula? Like, what's going on here? Well, honestly, I would say this game takes the most from Bloodborne, actually. It feels more similar to that game in terms of its level design, in terms of its pacing, and in terms of all of its mechanics. It is very Bloodborne-esque, which I think is a good thing because, well, first off, we don't have Bloodborne on PC, but I also just think that more games taking inspiration from that in general is a good thing because not very many Souls-likes do actually take a whole lot of inspiration from Bloodborne. It was a very difficult formula to reproduce, I think, and I feel that this game manages a really good job at it. So first off, you do play a set character, somewhat unusually for the genre. You do not create your character, but you are instead Geppetto's puppet, as everyone calls you. And in fact, the name Pinocchio does not seem to be used at all in this game, I'm assuming for a reason. Everyone either calls you Geppetto's puppet or Clever One, not actually referring to you with the big P. So that's kind of interesting, but you are a puppet, and you are in an extremely dark, sort of retold world, with Geppetto still alive, but his puppets going out of control. Well, not entirely his puppets, there's also some other inventors involved, but basically this is a world where a sort of puppet-based apocalypse has occurred, and this sort of derangement of all of these puppets has, well, combined with some other factors, including a big wasting kind of disease called the petrification disease that is very literal. It's petrifying people and killing them. And this whole city is just in a really bad place right now. The city of Krat, this sort of interesting fictional coastal city where all of this stuff is happening, and it's kind of your job to figure out why you've been awakened, what is actually causing the disease, and what is causing the derangement of the puppets, and what this is all actually leading to, because there is some sort of ancient, interesting stuff behind the scenes that you'll only start to uncover later. Mechanically, it's got a lot of familiar stuff. You've got your usual health and stamina up there in the top left, but you've also got these blue segmented bits. These are called Fable charges, and every weapon has Fable arts, which are sort of like weapon arts from Dark Souls and Elden Ring. And they use these charges. You build up these charges just by doing damage to enemies, and then you can expend them to do the arts, and every weapon will have two different ones, the blade and the handle, each having one, which we'll explain in a minute, but this means the game has a lot of combat variety to it because you have quite an extensive moveset for each weapon with light and heavy attacks as well as chargeable attacks, sprinting, dodge attacks, backstep attacks, and a lot of these have both light and heavy variations as well as being chargeable. So there's a lot of stuff here. And you've also got, of course, these two arts, and the arts can vary. They can enchant your weapon with an element, they can be a sort of big heavy hit of some kind, they can be an entire combo. Some arts can actually be held or charged to expend more charges for an increased effect, whereas others you can chain the activation of the art multiple times to do these big, impressive, flourishing combos that take up a bunch of charges but are really, really powerful and often have very big, sweeping hits that are good against, larger crowds of enemies and stuff. So the combat is really quite good in this game. Now, you would hope it would be, of course, because that is one of the things you're going to be doing the most, but it is very Bloodborne-esque combat. So it's super enjoyable and is the highlight of the game for me in terms of how everything works, just because of the weapons. The weapons are really, really interesting. They have two different pieces. Every weapon has a blade and a handle, and you can actually split these apart and mix and match them. So you can have the handle from one weapon and the blade of a different one together. And this will alter, I think, their reach a little bit, but also it'll alter how it scales with your stats. The handle mostly determines that. And you also, of course, get the blade's Fable art and the handle's Fable art together, so whatever you mix and match will give you the combination of arts that you want. So it's a really cool system, and the weapons are pretty cool, from big swords that look like clock hands, to giant electrical pizza cutters, to big explosive pick hammer things. There's a lot of weapons here, and they are very cool. They definitely remind me a lot of trick weapons, and in fact, I think there are some that that were directly inspired by Bloodborne's trick weapons. Like, for instance, the electrical coil mace thingy that you'll have seen in the initial clip in the background, that is very much like the Tonitrus from Bloodborne. It works pretty much exactly the same. It's got a similar moveset, and one of its weapon arts is actually to enwreath it in lightning to up its lightning damage a bunch, just like the transformation for the Tonitrus is. So I have a feeling that there was some definite inspiration there. But there are also boss weapons in this game. They're called special weapons, and these work a little bit differently. They require a different resource to upgrade. Instead of the moonstones of the normal weapons, you need dark moonstones. Instead, they're much more rare. And you get these in the way that you would expect. You know, bosses drop an ergo, which is like the souls of this game, and you can take that special ergo to a collector and exchange it for a weapon or a medallion, which are like rings, basically. And these special weapons are really fun. They tend to have unique movesets to them that are unlike anything else. They also have some really powerful fable arts that are also usually unique to them. And also, they are one unit. They can't be taken apart, so you can't take the blade of one boss weapon and the handle of another and combine them or anything like that. They have to be used together. But they are really cool, and they often have some really neat stuff, like the big mechanical 7-branch greatsword thing that causes multiple explosions when you swing it. That's pretty cool. Or the big like scythe-like thing that I've been using, which has a sort of scythe blade on a chain that you can whip around. I should also mention, by the way, that this game uses an interesting version of the Bloodborne rally system. So if you don't know, when you get hit in Bloodborne, some of your health gauge stays behind, and you can be aggressive and actually hit the enemy in return and get some of that health back, so you can have your health gauge climb back up that lost portion. This game uses that, but in a way I've never seen before. So just taking damage normally doesn't do this. However, you can block, and if you block damage, that's when this refillable gauge appears. So you can actually heal some of the blocked damage back by attacking enemies directly afterwards. This is also because this has a bit of Sekiro DNA in it, and you have a perfect guard that you're encouraged to use. You have a Bloodborne dashing dodge that does have immunity frames, but it's very, very small numbers of them, so you're not really encouraged to dodge through attacks most of the time. Instead, you should be blocking them, because if you manage to perfect block, block right before an attack hits you, it will deflect the attack, it will damage the enemy's weapon, which can actually destroy its weapon, by the way, and it even causes some enemies to change movesets eventually, or lose a bunch of range and stuff like that, and you won't take any damage at all this way. So you're heavily encouraged not to dodge most of the time, and instead to perfect block everything as much as you can. And some enemies will have multi-hit combos, and if you perfect block every hit, on the last hit, they'll get like heavily staggered, and you can get a bunch of free hits in. And also there is a stagger mechanic where, in combination with big charged heavy attacks as well as perfect blocks, the enemy's health gauge will eventually start flashing white, and when this happens, you can hit them with either a fable art or a heavy charge attack, and it'll cause them to stagger and allow you to get a lethal attack in, which is sort of like a Bloodborne Visceral, a big, huge, heavy attack for big damage. So overall, this kind of gives the combat a bit of a risk-reward idea where, you can dodge away from attacks, but this will leave you unable to punish the enemy's openings for those attacks. And instead, if you stand in the way and manage to block it with just the right timing, you can make the enemy vulnerable and retaliate with huge damage. So yeah, very high-speed, high-risk combat system for sure. So basically what I'm saying is the combat is awesome in this game, and is a huge highlight of the experience. There are some other quality of life things that are kind of interesting. Like, for one, you'll notice you have 2 different item quick use slots rather than the one. In a lot of Souls-likes you have one, and you press the down on the D-pad, down button, to switch between them, and then you press the use button to use them. But in this case you actually have 2 that you can switch between, and each one can have multiple slots. So you actually have sort of 2 quick uses available at any time, one on up and one on down, and you can press up and down again in order to switch through those pockets. I think this is a really smart upgrade on the quick item use pocket system. I think it's a good idea, and I really like that they did it. You also have some extra quick use slots that you don't normally see, and you access these by holding the A button down and then pressing one of the 4 directions on the D-pad. You've also got weapon durability in this game, and they made it matter more than it usually does in these games, but it also isn't annoying, which is impressive to me, because a lot of times it kind of is. Either weapon durability is something that barely matters and doesn't even need to be in the game, or it matters too much and it gets obnoxious, but I think they managed to strike a pretty good middle ground this time, because you have weapon durability, and as a weapon gets more and more broken down, it will actually start to deflect off of monsters, kind of like it does in Monster Hunter when your sharpness goes down, and eventually it'll break and it will have decreased damage. You can still use it, it just kind of sucks. But the thing is, you also have a grindstone with you at all times. It's actually built into your left arm, which is mechanical. And you can just hold the button down and you will grind the grindstone on your weapon and refill the bar for as long as you're holding it down. And also, the longer you hold it down, the faster it refills. It has like momentum to it. So you can actually do this in mid-battle very effectively because it doesn't take very long. And it's just a little extra thing to keep an eye on and make sure you keep topped up. Also, eventually you'll get these special grindstones that you can put in this grinder that are sort of like reusable pine resins. They allow you to enchant a weapon with an elemental damage type as long as it doesn't already have one. And there are consumables that allow you to do this too, but the grindstones refresh every time you go back to a stargazer, which are your bonfires. You also do have the use of your left arm as well. There are multiple different arms you can choose from. You can actually attach different ones. They're called Legion arms, and that yellow bar on the bottom left is your Legion gauge, which the arm uses as like fuel. You can almost think of it as like an MP gauge because it doesn't refill on its own normally. You either have to use these magazines to refill it or rest at a stargazer to get it back up. And the arms are really cool. The basic one you start out with is just a punch, but it's a really satisfying, chargeable, heavy punch. You can also get things like a flamethrower that actually gets the ability to explode. You can get a big electrical burst, or a cannon, or a shield, a mine layer. There are several different ones you can get, and they're all also upgradable. You can find these things called Legion calibers, which you can use to upgrade an arm, and every arm has 4 total upgrades, just improving whatever it does in some way. They're usually really powerful too, so you definitely want them. But there aren't very many of them, which is why eventually in this game, when you get the ability to respec, your Legion arm upgrades is actually one of the things that you can respec. Level design is very, very good this time around. This game has some really nice level design. This is another thing that reminds me of Bloodborne. It's got a lot of really complex, big levels with a lot of locked doors and shortcuts and a lot of sort of backtracking, but not in the annoying way. Backtracking as in like going back to previous areas and opening new parts of them up. You know, lowerable ladders, destroyable doors, and some other things like that. So there's a lot of stuff to be found when it comes to the exploration in this game, and you are very heavily rewarded for exploring. There are all kinds of weapons and upgrade materials for all sorts of various things, your moonstones, your dark moonstones, your Legion calibers. There are plugs which allow you to craft new arms, and there's also lots of internal components to find, and this is something to explain. So you know how in a lot of Soulsborne games, it's fashion Souls, right? You wear the clothes that make your character look cool. You go for a specific look. You don't really care about the stats. It's more about how you look. Well, they've taken that to heart in this game, and your armor, in quotes, the stuff that you wear to improve your defensive stats, doesn't change your appearance at all. And the stuff that does change your appearance, those are costumes that you find by exploring, and those don't have stats on them. So you can look however you want and still have good defensive stats. There are 4 different internal slots for different kinds of armor pieces, like these frames, liners, injectors, and some other things like that, that just determine your resistance to certain status ailments, your resistance to elemental damage, to physical damage, all that stuff. But of course, all these things also have weight, and you do need to level up your capacity to hold more weight in order to, you know, not fat roll, basically, because these things do get quite heavy, especially once you get to the really big ones later in the game. And of the various pieces of clothing you can find, they all look really cool. They've got this sort of Renaissance era look to them, a lot of them do, and maybe even some later stuff, you know, maybe a little bit of Victorian influence and some things like that. There's really cool stuff here, and not only is it all really well modeled, but also it has a lot of like dynamic grime that gets on it. So if you roll through a swamp, your shirt will end up all gross for a while. If you attack some puppets, you'll get their black, oily stuff all over you, and attack the carcass enemies, you'll get their glowing blue blood on you and stuff like that. So your weapons and your character are covered in all the nastiness of the area around you, which is a pretty cool touch. And it definitely helps with the atmosphere. I would say atmosphere is a good word for this game. Its overall music and visual presentation lends itself to this grungy, industrial, sort of European, beautiful epic period, I think is probably what they're going for. It's definitely got a lot going for it visually. It's a beautiful game. It looks really, really detailed. The environments have a crap load of detail in them, and the enemies all have some really cool detailed animations because, well, half of them are puppets, so obviously they move like puppets, right? They're jittery and kind of creepy and weird, and the other half of the enemies are carcasses, which are these undead humans afflicted with this disease, and they are really disturbing looking and have some really strange mannerisms if you allow them to just kind of walk around. Another thing that reminds me of Bloodborne's citizens sometimes being kind of maddened and odd in a lot of ways. The music is definitely of note here. The music is great. It's got, well, it's sort of general level exploration music is pretty calm a lot of the times. It's kind of chill, but also a little bit foreboding, I would say. But then its boss music is some really bombastic stuff that has a lot of different sort of big instrumental layers to it. And there's also these records you can collect to play at the hub area, the hotel, that you go back to your safe zone. And you can play these whenever you want. And they all sound really good. I'm not sure who the vocalist is that they have gotten for these songs, but her voice is beautiful. It's a really pretty voice. And the overall tone of these songs is kind of jazzy, somber music. It's really cool stuff. I think the story will keep a lot of people interested as well because it's a pretty good story. It is presented in that familiar Soulsborne fashion where you start out not knowing anything and you kind of have to infer a lot by environmental storytelling and little bits that you get from NPCs and stuff, and also from item descriptions. It does a good job of that, I think, and its overall world is definitely interesting. I mean, you start out with just not really knowing anything. You know, you see that people are dying from this petrification disease and that puppets have gone crazy, and that's about all you know. You don't know why any of these things are happening. And as you go through the game, more and more gets revealed, and you start to realize that these things are related, and that this stuff called ergo might be at fault, and then eventually you learn what ergo actually is, and you figure out that there was like an ancient civilization involved, which also changes some things, and things get pretty neat. I would say the game does a good job of having multiple factions to understand, because you've got the stalkers, which are kind of like hunters, and you've got the puppets themselves, which do have some personality, and this is related to the whole ergo thing, which makes a lot more sense once you figure out what it actually is. And then you've got, of course, all the people that you're harboring at the hotel yourself, people that you've rescued and people that have come to you for help. There are NPC quest lines to do, and a lot of them are chains of items that you need to keep, like, you know, deliver this item to this character, they'll give you this thing which you keep for a couple areas, and then eventually it becomes useful later, and then you have to buy something from someone else, and then in the end you get some reveal about these characters and then some sort of big reward. It's pretty cool. One of the things the game likes to reward you with especially is quartz, by the way. You can level up like normal, you know, you gain ergo from killing enemies and you spend them at the level up waifu to level yourself up. Her name is Sophia and she is lovely, but you also get these things called quartz, and you can sit in this chair and put the quartz into your heart, basically. And when you do this, there are different nodes, and each one has a bonus that it gives you and a different number of quartz slots. And if you fill up all the quartz slots, it gives you whatever bonus it says. And then you can keep doing this, and eventually you move on to the next cluster of slots and keep going, and you'll unlock more and more advanced upgrades and better tiers of stuff. And whenever you upgrade something, you choose a small bonus that quartz represents. So basically you have like 2 quartz to put into your first slots, and then once you get both in, it gives you that bonus as well as whatever bonuses you chose for the individual quartz you put in. So it's like a collection of minor upgrades that add up to be something greater. And these can be all sorts of things, like the ability to chain multiple dodges together, or the ability to have more cells, more healing cells, your sort of rechargeable pulse cells that you use to heal yourself, your Estus flask, basically. And there's a whole bunch of different bonuses that you can get on this big tree. So this is sort of like a longer term gain in power as opposed to leveling, right? Because you're going to be leveling a lot more often than you're going to be finding quartz. It's a pretty rare reward, so you're not going to have all that many of them. But the quartz do represent like large chunks of power that you gain when you actually slot them all in, which is pretty cool. And it's just another way to help make yourself stronger. It's a fun reward to find by exploring or by completing an NPC questline or whatever in order to make yourself more powerful. There are some other things to do as well. You eventually find this tree, this gold coin fruit tree. It's a tree that grows these coins. Well, they're fruit, but they look like coins. And you can use these for a couple different things. You can buy these things called wish stones with them, which you eventually get this meteorite cube, and you can slot a wish stone into it and use it whenever you want to get some sort of effect, depending on the kind of wish stone you slotted into it. And you can also spend these fruit on respecs. After you complete the Grand Exhibition area, you'll unlock a statue that lets you respec your character in a couple different ways. You can refund all of your levels, you can refund all of the upgrades from one of your arms, and you can refund your quartz and reset those. But each time you use one of these, it gets more and more expensive. So you will need to gather more fruit in order to actually use it. And the fruit is actually on a real-world timer, so every certain number of minutes it grows some, and you can harvest it whenever you want to have all of it. You can also find some boosters and stuff later on that will allow it to grow faster and things like that. Boss fights, in my opinion, are very good. They can be pretty significant difficulty spikes, but they are really good boss battles. The music is definitely pretty memorable for a lot of them, but also just the battle itself is really fun. Bosses tend to have multiple phases in this game, sometimes entire, like, full health gauge phases, sometimes not, it depends. But the interesting thing is there's a couple of different kinds of bosses, basically. There's, like, world bosses or side bosses. Usually these are optional bosses that you will encounter just by walking around, and suddenly there'll be a health gauge at the bottom of the screen and you freak out and run away. And then there are the big story important boss fights that are in big arenas, and you can tell the difference because the world boss fights will just happen. You'll just wander around and there they are. But the story boss fights will have this sort of pool, this chalice outside of the boss room, and if you want, you can choose to sacrifice one of these consumables called a star piece in order to summon a specter for that boss fight. So this is the equivalent of summoning like an NPC phantom in Dark Souls, basically, except it takes a consumable to use, and you can just use it whenever you want and summon one spectre, although you can only have one per battle. So you won't get this spectral assistance for the more optional wandering around bosses, but you can choose to use them whenever you want on the big story important bosses. And I mean, hey, it's nice to have that bit of dynamic difficulty, right? Because the game is pretty challenging and the bosses can be very hard, so it's cool to have a sort of easier mode that you can choose to engage if you want. I've also noticed that the specters tend to use the boss weapons that you can get from the boss's ergo. So if you want, you can choose to use them as like a cool little preview of what you can actually get from beating that boss, which is kind of neat. So overall, I think Lies of P is fantastic. I think it is a very interesting take on the Souls-like formula. I love that it's more Bloodborne inspired. I really like its creepy, puppety aesthetic and its really dark presentation, while also being a genuinely quite interesting story with some characters that I actually do want to see the resolution of, because some things get explained later on and things start to make more sense, and it's, you know, it's a good set of reveals. You can only pull reveals like that and make them feel good if you actually made the players care about the story, right? You made them care about the characters and the world, and I feel the game does a good enough job of that to actually make these reveals feel worthwhile. But even if you don't care about the story, the combat in this game is stellar. It's really good combat with very creative and fun weapons and really fun enemies. So it manages to be just a really good example of the genre in general. And the world and its presentation and its exploration as you get to go through the areas is really satisfying, because it does that classic thing of see a thing in the distance and eventually you'll be able to go to it. And also that feeling of familiarity when you unlock a shortcut to an earlier area and notice how they actually connect together, and it feels really good. You know, it does a good job of that. So yeah, in my opinion, a fantastic take on the Souls-like formula. Definitely one of the best examples of a non-From Souls-like, in my opinion, and it's going to manage to have a really nice puppety clockwork crown, I think, for a long time because of how good it actually is. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for this game so that you can go and check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.